Here's a claim W.E.B. Du Bois published in 1920, and it still lands like a shock. Being white, he said, is a brand new way to be a person, a thing of the 19th and 20th centuries. He put it in a book called Darkwater, in an essay titled The Souls of White Folk, and he did not soften it. Du Bois wrote, quote, "The discovery of personal whiteness among the world's peoples is a very modern thing, a 19th and 20th century matter indeed," end quote. He isn't saying nobody ever noticed skin before. He grants that earlier ages saw color and made much less of it. The ancient world, he says, would have laughed at the idea of sorting people that way. What he calls new is the day the world turned color into an identity, into a club with members and a claim. We tend to treat white as a thing some people simply are. Du Bois wants us to read it as a thing that got made, and then to ask the harder question: what was it made to do? So that is where we're headed. Where did the idea of white people come from? And what was that invention built to own? I'll follow 4 scenes in his argument: a tower, a schoolroom, a map, and a street. And then, unusually, he keeps the answer from turning into its own mirror image. Start with what the word is supposed to describe. If white were only a shade of skin, it would be as small a fact as brown eyes, and nobody would build a world on it. So what is it? Du Bois watches the white world from what he calls a tower above the human sea, and he asks it, straight out, what its whiteness actually is. The answer he keeps getting back is not, in the end, about skin. There's an easy way to get him wrong here, so I want to be careful. Du Bois wrote, quote, "Whiteness is the ownership of the earth forever and ever, amen," end quote. He's not saying anyone chants that at breakfast. He says it is the answer he is given to understand, silently but clearly, under all the polite talk about the weather. The little mock prayer, the forever and ever amen, is his way of catching the tone of a thing people treat as eternal and holy. So on his reading, whiteness is not really a color at all. It is a claim to own the earth, and, he argues across the chapter, to control the darker peoples on it. And the whole thing wears the costume of a plain, natural fact. That changes the stakes completely. A shade of skin has no enemies and no property. A claim to own the earth has both. And once you hear whiteness as a claim instead of a description, the next question is unavoidable. How does a claim that big ever come to feel like ordinary common sense? Du Bois puts the answer in the least suspicious place there is, in what children get taught. A claim this big should be easy to see through. It survives, he says, because it gets installed early, and because of everything it quietly leaves out. Du Bois wrote, quote, "How easy then, by emphasis and omission, to make children believe that every great soul the world ever saw was a white man's soul, that every great thought the world ever knew was a white man's thought, that every great deed the world ever did was a white man's deed, that every great dream the world ever sang was a white man's dream," end quote. 2 words are holding that sentence up: emphasis and omission. It's not mainly a story about teachers who lie. It's a story about what gets stressed, what gets left out, and how the leaving out does the real work. A moment later, Du Bois acts out the excuse the whole setup gives for itself. And this is the spot where he gets quoted wrong. He puts a question in the mouth of the defender, whether, even if all of it is a lie, it isn't a lie in a great cause. That line is not what Du Bois believes. He drags the excuse into the open so he can throw it back. So the flattering version of history has to say its own name out loud. And the point underneath is quiet, and hard to shake. The invention doesn't feel like a claim because it reaches us as a lesson, before we're old enough to argue back, built as much out of what got skipped as what got said. But a lesson like that can never tell you what the claim is really worth once the bill comes due. This is where Du Bois takes the idea outdoors, and it stops being comfortable. If whiteness is a claim to own the earth, then follow it to the places where it gets enforced. First a map, then a mob. On the map, it is empire. Writing about Africa, he puts the whole thing in one line. Du Bois wrote, quote, "The present problem of problems is nothing more than democracy beating itself helplessly against the color bar," end quote. That phrase, "nothing more than," is an overstatement, but the point underneath is serious. What Du Bois calls the barbarous scramble for exploitation by individual states and the 4th century Atlantic slave trade that, by his estimate, cost Black Africa 100 million lives is, I'd say, the same ownership claim, only drawn at the size of a planet. Then he pushes further into a claim that is his, not settled history. Du Bois argues the First World War itself grew mostly out of white nations fighting over what he calls the largest share in exploiting the darker races. He calls that cause the main one, while granting the others were real. And he names the hypocrisy in it. He sets the mourning over invaded Belgium against the lynchings back home. He calls the black man America's Belgium, and he lists the towns one by one: Memphis, Waco, Washington, Dyersburg, Estill Springs. And then he brings it all the way home to his account of East St. Louis in 1917, where, he says, a wartime factory conflict turned into a massacre of black residents by white mobs. Du Bois will not let the authorities off. Du Bois wrote, quote, "Firemen, policemen, and militiamen stood with hanging hands or even joined eagerly with the mob," end quote. Hanging hands. They stood there and let it happen, or they joined in. And his account of why is not simple. A long history of insult and discrimination, he says, had festered under the surface, and then a labor fight set it off. The unions had shut black workers out completely. No black builder or printer or machinist could even join one. So when the anger at the employers and at the white union men needed somewhere to go, it turned onto black workers instead. He calls those workers the unwise men. What they feared, he says, was the definite death of their rising dreams, and what they wanted was a monopoly of common labor. That reading of the mob is his, and he pushes it harder than the plain words can prove. Put the two together, and I read the map and the mob as the same claim at two different sizes. By now, a fair listener is holding a suspicion. A man this furious at whiteness, isn't he just raising a flag of his own? So let me put the strongest version of that suspicion, because it deserves a fair hearing before I argue against it. It goes like this. Du Bois is doing to whiteness exactly what whiteness did to everyone else, just with the colors flipped. And the book hands you real material for that read. It is furious. He dares the reader to picture the next census reporting half of Black America dead and the other half dying, and to check what his own soul feels in reply. In The Riddle of the Sphinx, the poem set right after this essay, there is a hatred so total it wants to sound their knell, and he gives that voice to the poem's speaker, the sad Black South. If that were all the book did, Revenge with Footnotes would be a fair verdict. But it isn't all the book does. Even that poem, before it ends, turns away from the hatred toward a burden of being human shared across colors, yellow and black and white alike. And Du Bois builds the case against the revenge reading himself. Near the front of the book, in a short piece called Credo, he lays out his creed, and it holds two things at once. He believes, it says, in one God who made every nation on earth from a single blood. The creed praises the Negro race, its genius and its soul, and then it puts a limit on that pride. A pride of self deep enough to scorn doing injustice to anyone else. A pride of family deep enough to look down on no one's father. Then he goes further and gives the other side its due in the hardest way there is. He grants that European civilization has, in fact, come out on top. It has, he says, and of that he has no doubt and never did. And then he denies that race is what explains it. The reasons for that success, he argues, lie well outside Europe, in foundations that other peoples laid long before, and in the sheer size of the stage that history handed it, not in the blood of the men who happened to be standing on it. So he is not a man who thinks race explains greatness, though in the same chapter, he also insists there is no European soul that the great figures of Africa and Asia cannot match and outmatch, and he names them: Nefertari, Muhammad, Ramses, Askia, Confucius, even Buddha and Christ. To me, that still sounds like a ranking of peoples, just with the top spot up for grabs. And that is my objection, not his. Either way, the tension between the creed and the comparison stays alive on the page. What the creed does is set a moral limit on the fury. It holds back the mirror image reading. It does not quite disprove it. And notice where Du Bois finally lets the anger land. Du Bois wrote, quote, "A vast pity. Pity for a people imprisoned and enthralled, hampered and made miserable for such a cause, for such a fantasy," end quote. That last word is doing a lot of work. Fantasy. He pities white people for building their whole selves around what he calls a fantasy, a fable, an illusion that, as I read him, still ran on very real power over very real lives. The fury and the pity sit on the same page, and the honest reading does not blend them into one clean feeling. It holds both. So, on Du Bois's account, being white is tied up with owning an empire, and with the belief system built to excuse it. A claim that was invented, taught to children, drawn onto maps, and paid for with a robbed continent and a burning city. And I read his refusal to treat that order as permanent, as an invitation to imagine it undone. But hold the tension. The same book that sees the invention most clearly and can even pity the people it trapped does not put its rage away. That census dare is aimed at the reader's own conscience, not offered as a tidy report of how Du Bois himself feels. Seeing a thing clearly does not stop it from costing you. So here's the argument I'll leave you with. Call it the tower and the street. From the tower, whiteness is a fantasy, a thing believed, and you fight it by refusing to believe it and refusing to teach it. From the street, going back to that mob in East St. Louis, it looks more like a set of rewards. The wages and the labor monopoly Du Bois described in that Massacre. And here, my own guess goes past what he says. If that is what whiteness really is, then not believing in it may not be enough until you also change who gets paid. I think the street is the harder half, but which one gives first, the belief or the reward, is the question I take from him. He wrote from the tower and about the street both, and the book is strong enough to argue with you if you land on the other side.